What if we could push Nintendo Switch past its limits to improve performance in its most cutting-edge games? That's the question I asked myself this week as I took to the world of Switch modding. Using a hacked console with all the risks that involves, the doors really do blow wide open on what you can change at your leisure. So much is possible, from boosting its CPU and GPU clocks for a better frame rate, to upgrading graphics quality with user-made tweaks. It goes to show a lot more is possible under the hood of an already fantastic console. With The Witcher 3 as an example then, I wanted to explore the options on the table. With full access to its menus, can we improve its visuals? Can we push this game to higher resolutions? And what about attaining a smoother frame rate, up to 60 frames per second, in a game that's already pushing Switch hard at 30 FPS? Let's find out. Alright, first let's take a step back to look at how Switch runs with no modding, hacking or otherwise. In its 3 years on the market, I'm actually amazed at what we've got running on there. Switch developers have gone far beyond what I'd expected in extracting the most from that mobile Tegra X1 chipset, tackling games that are built for far more powerful systems. Seemingly impossible ports like The Witcher 3, Wolfenstein 2, and even Mortal Kombat 11 were made possible with some smart engineering choices, though of course always with trade-offs next to the PS4 or Xbox One counterparts. In every case, each conversion needs a careful balancing act to optimize for Switch's GPU and CPU clocks, as determined by Nintendo early on. The fact of the matter is though that X1 chipset in Switch is ostensibly the same parts as the Nvidia Shield's 2017 revisions. It's the same component, but as you may know, with one key change. To make Switch work as a handheld, its CPU and GPU clock speeds were forcibly lowered by Nintendo to a lesser value, mainly to save on battery power while on the go. This also does have benefits for overall heat, reliability, and fan noise, though the bottom line is it's a more powerful machine than most realise. The numbers? A 1.78 GHz CPU speed on Shield was dropped to just 1 GHz on Switch, while the GPU dropped from 921 MHz on Shield down to 768 MHz in its docked configuration, and lower still of course while handheld. Again, this is all in aid of it having that portable feature running off a small battery, but that's quite the drop. In other words, there's power going entirely unused, especially if you only play Switch docked under a TV, which is the focus for this analysis. The good news then, a modified Switch can restore those Shield clocks to the machine, a 75% increase on CPU and 20% on the GPU. Using The Witcher 3 as an example then, the first test is to see what that overclock does versus the standard playthrough. The Witcher 3 is of course an interesting test subject, a game that demands both CPU and GPU intensely in different areas. Saber Interactive and CD Projekt Red managed to port a game with dense open world rendering and get it all running at 20 to 30 frames per second. A dynamic resolution helped with GPU load, but CPU driven areas like Novigrad could struggle with the high character counts and lots of draw calls. With an overclock in place, the goalposts move entirely, and yes, as I'll get onto later, that means headroom to improve the visuals ourselves. So first up, this is docked play on regular Switch GPU and CPU clocks. All visual settings are left as standard. This is what we have out of the box. I'm simply unlocking the frame rate here to go up to 60 frames per second, something you can't do normally, to show the reality of performance behind that 30 FPS cap Saber uses. Obviously, we're not getting to 60, but you can see what's happening. I've also kept some useful diagnostics at the top, with frame times on the CPU and GPU on show. Oh, and plus, there's a rolling update on what resolution is actually being used at any point. This is all fascinating stuff. It shows how well dynamic that dynamic resolution system really is, and that actually we're rarely tapping into a full 720p native res. More often than not, and going by the numbers here, we're looking at 548p in places like the Crookback Bog, or 636p in that Griffin battle. It's always in flux, and rarely at 720p in reality. It does though reveal the kind of tussle that goes on behind the scenes to keep its frame rate at the intended 30 FPS target. The frame rate stats are still a big part of the story. This classic Novigrad run shows the range a regular Switch on standard clocks goes through. Outside the city, most spots go above 30 FPS, even galloping at full speed shows plenty of overhead to just keep the game running fluidly with a cap. This is a crucial point though. If there's enough headroom to go much higher than say 35 FPS, the GPU power is instead put into raising the resolution until it gets to 720p. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? To focus on image quality and make the most of Switch's resources. That level of adaptability is essential to getting this game working to adjust to every scenario. Now later I'll be showing what happens once you switch dynamic resolution scaling or DRS off entirely, the way it looks and how it impacts performance. But with it enabled as usual, the standard Switch clocks have no trouble holding a solid frame rate most of the time. That is with key exceptions. Clearly, areas like Novigrad are a struggle. The sheer volume of NPCs, the count of which is kept the same as PS4 and Xbox One, is an issue for that 1GHz clock CPU. It buckles once you get into the complex market area, and we're basically looking at 25 FPS. The high number of draw calls as well, instructions to the CPU to render each object in, will also be an issue here, and obviously there's no easy way to fix that. Changing the resolution won't do anything for this. This is a mechanic, a core fundamental aspect of the game's design that can't be swapped out or changed. The only way around these drops is to overclock the system. Here we have it, same scenario, same settings, but with the CPU pushed to 1785 MHz and the GPU at 921. This is the maximum overclock on right compared to the regular clocks on left. Dynamic res is kept on either side, and visual settings like foliage are matched at the default high setting. Looking at a GPU intensive scene like this, the gains, it must be said, aren't wild. We've already established CD Projekt Red's engine sooner stabilizes the resolution at 720p than boosts the frame rate. Indeed, maxing clocks while docked doesn't mean a huge performance increase over 30 FPS, so long as DRS is still enabled. What it does do though is help Switch to push out 720p more often in places where the resolution so often drops on stock clocks. So for example, this grassy area outside Novigrad runs at 1064 by 596 on stock, but gets boosted to 1280 by 720 on the overclock, while the frame rate is broadly the same. Otherwise, in terms of frame rates, there's not always so much in it. For example, this GPU intensive cutscene with loads of icy effects shows a delta of around 3 to 4 FPS, but not much more. What we get here is still an upgrade. The most notable change is the CPU driven stuff, if we're focusing on the frame rate anyway. In the big cities, this is the standout point. Check this out, Novigrad Market now runs at up to 8 frames per second faster, completely eliminating the frame rate issues here. Supposing you added a 30 FPS cap again, you're in business. It's perfectly smooth at last, and the overclock fixes one of the game's biggest trouble spots. The catch, it must be said, is that throughout all these overclock tests, I did notice my Switch was kicking the fan into its highest speed setting. Not a huge distraction, but something to bear in mind. This console has a small vent up top to work with, and the smaller the fan size and higher the RPM, the noisier a machine gets. Playing a Switch like this, you may want to invest in an adapter to keep the console outside the dock, but overall I had no issues with overheating over tens of hours of play. The overclock solves one big problem then, those sub 30 FPS drops in CPU bottlenecked environments. And yet, you get the sense we could do more with that extra processing power. What if instead we pushed the boat out visually? I mean, consider the main criticisms we had of The Witcher 3 on Switch when it arrived. Chief among them was the blurry image quality owing to its dynamic res system. Rarely does it actually hit a full 720p, and the resulting picture is often very muddied by the scaling, especially up to 1080p or 4K displays. In an ideal world then, how might the game look if it were fixed permanently at 1280 by 720? As it turns out, the game can be modified to do exactly that. I've tried to go higher to 1080p, but to no avail, though locking at 720p is absolutely an option here. It's a bit of work, but worth it. Here's a comparison showing dynamic resolution scaling enabled versus disabled. A run through on regular GPU clocks is used on left to show how the image gets degraded for regular Switch users with DRS enabled. On the right we have an overclocked Switch with DRS disabled, and instead this is just a set to render flat out at 720p. No question, it's a far better looking game this way. Especially in the stress points where the reds would usually buckle to some low figure, we get a huge gulf in clarity all round. Check out this spot on the besieged town. It's rendering at a native 596p in this moment on left, but forcing 720p on right, a massive boost. It must be said, all of this comes at a cost. Even running with an overclock, The Witcher 3 is an effects heavy game that really needs the flexibility of DRS to suit any situation. In most cases it's fine, but honestly forcing such a high number is a recipe for disaster if you want to hold 30fps in spots like Crookback Bog. Here's how that pans out. Let's assume you have the overclock in place plus foliage set to ultra, which I'll talk more on in a minute. The fact is, entire areas that used to run well at 30fps or above on an overclock, like Crookback Bog, now tumble back into the low 20s. To be blunt, it's worse than playing on regular clock speeds with DRS enabled. The max overclock does not compensate for the fixing of 720p, and the Switch just can't do it smoothly everywhere you go. Getting the game to 720p is an interesting experiment, but there's a more direct way to boost the visual settings. Thanks to an enhanced setting mod added to the game directory, you can actually play with a more fleshed out graphics option menu. This is still work in progress. Most toggles you would find on PC actually don't work on Switch. The textures, for example, are locked in place at one setting, since really there aren't better assets on the cartridge itself. What this enhanced settings mod does do is add toggles for foliage visibility, light shafts, anti-aliasing, water quality, depth of field, sharpening, and bloom. That's on top of the existing motion blur toggles included officially by Saber. Most of these are admittedly post effects with only a fractional impact on performance, but that foliage setting is extremely powerful. It aims to fix one of the key issues I had with the game in the level of pop-in. Let's give that foliage setting a test. You get 4 presets from low to ultra, though bear in mind Switch runs at the high setting by default, and so the scope for improvement isn't as huge as you might expect. Even so, the jump from low to medium shows it affects grass tuft density on the ground, as well as the rendering of trees on the horizon. Moving to ultra fills out the scene with more foliage over the base game, and you can see just a little more detail added all round. One thing to note, this does incur the biggest performance hit of any of the settings. Going from low to ultra, you can lose up to 3 to 4 frames per second on average, so not a choice to take lightly. Still, it's fascinating to see the game being tuned up like this. Another tweak that makes a tangible change is the sharpening filter. It's popular in the modding community and the performance hit is really quite minimal. Sliding it on and off, high contrast points are boosted, and on a native 720p image here, it gives the impression of a sharper image. There's more shimmer as a result, but a neat option to have nonetheless. The anti-aliasing toggle is there too if you want to go all the way. Not recommended obviously, but an option if you want to see the game's frame buffer raw, and if you dislike the way the anti-aliasing works. Now, sadly, there are points which I wish could be solved here. For example, due to the size of Switch's cartridge, texture assets remain compressed compared to PS4, though at least a mod does exist to restore its original audio. We also still have NPCs running at a lower frame rate on the distance. Meanwhile, texture filtering is on the blurry side, though with time I believe that could be solved. Right now, we do at least have a boosted resolution, better foliage, and post-effect toggles to enhance the visuals. There's one last thing to try here. With the ability to fix the resolution at any number and tweak the foliage to any setting, what if we gave up on image quality altogether? What if we traded it all in for the 60fps dream on Switch? It seems impossible on the outset given 30 is enough of a challenge. but with an overclock in place we're closer than you might think. Now, dropping the post-effect settings doesn't help much, but foliage draw does, and so here I put that to low. Meanwhile, the dynamic res is now fixed at around 832 by 468, though this can still fluctuate very slightly. The results are obviously blurred to the extreme, the lowest point the DRS can drop to while docked. And yet, is this all enough to make 60 FPS a reality? The results, as you can see, are pretty mixed. The White Orchard area is the most impressive showcase for how close it gets. We're largely between 55 and 60 FPS most of the way around. A bit plain and barren, yes, but it's still remarkable how smooth the game suddenly becomes. Where this idea starts to unravel is later areas. The outskirts of Novigrad are between 45 and 60 FPS, and even with the fluctuation, it still feels far better to play than the regular setup. All of this, of course, is predicated on the game being GPU bound, however, and using the lower resolution as a crutch to get a better frame rate. It's a flawed approach really, when you factor in big towns and cities where the CPU frame time is the bottleneck. At lowest, we're back down to 30 FPS anyway in Novigrad city centre, and likewise for the village in the White Orchard. Switch just can't do either of these consistently. The rule of thumb then, outdoors areas benefit hugely from the dropped resolution, while city spots have negligible gains. 60 FPS is just within reach in the right spots then, and it makes a difference to gameplay. It's actually odd to think this is also something we can't see on PS4 or Xbox One right now. If you can stomach the degraded image quality, an overclocked Switch can stretch to some remarkable feats, all the more so given how unlikely it felt we'd see The Witcher 3 running on it at all. Stretching the console in all these ways though, to a fixed 720p, to better visuals, to 60 FPS, all points to the same verdict here. CDPR and Saber Interactive, for all the cutbacks and tweaks made on the Switch version, made the right calls in optimising the game. On the hardware standard clocks, it's hard to see how much more could have been added. Besides giving users the option for, say, a more resolution-focused mode at a serious cost of performance on stock clocks, we have a neatly designed port, all things considered. It's a level-headed compromise between visuals and frame rate. The only regret is these teams didn't get a chance to optimise around the Shield's Tegra X1 clock speeds, where the boat could have been pushed out in all of these ways. The Witcher 3 is just one example though, and this overclock could stand to benefit so many other titles. And of course that applies to portable play too, so long as you can accept the extra draw on your battery. But that's all I have time for today. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what you'd like to see tested. If you have any, leave me a note in the comments. Otherwise, do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with me, John, Alex or Rich, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.